Hello, my name is Brennan Remington, and welcome to this special episode of Pancake Psychology. Whoosh. We're all dressed up here because what I'm presenting today is a project that I've been working on over the last year, and it's my undergraduate honors project, my honors thesis, called the IQ Qualum. It's a review of historical and current intelligence quantification methods, and especially how cultural bias can play to affect them. My advisor was Dr. Seth Tackett, and it's been a really great learning experience for me, and I can advise definitely if you do have an undergraduate thesis route to take advantage of it and the resources that come with it and get that experience before you start applying to your graduate and postgraduate level studies. And honestly, with things like this, I'm going to use this to build into my master's thesis and have that master's thesis build into a dissertation. It kind of compounds, and you can start to reference yourself and really gather and get familiar with the literature before you have to come to it. Anyways, getting back on topic, this is my thesis. I defended it 2 days ago on March 20th, and it was successful. Lasted probably 23 minutes for my presentation, 22 minutes of questions and answers, and then, whatever deliberation they had. And I'm working on the final edits for it now because I have 2 more conferences at least to present it at, if not, any others that I get utility out of. So without any further ado, let's get into it. There's 6 main sections that I wanted to look at that I've kind of divided. So there's going to be sections at the bottom of the video with all of these. There's my introduction. I'll look at pre-IQ intelligence testing. I'll look into the IQ era, which is just the 20th century intelligence testing. And then I'm going to look at cultural bias in the intelligence testing, and then have my discussion and my conclusions that I drew from my research. So, an introduction. And all references are going to appear at the bottom. I start each section with just a little quote from my thesis here. So, to start, what you really have to do is define intelligence as a concept, because there's so many things that intelligence could refer to, and the way that you quantify and measure intelligence is highly subjective on these things, which is something we'll get more into later. So intelligence, across some of the definitions, can include somebody's capability for logic, somebody's capacity for learning, or the amount of knowledge that somebody has gained. And when you think about this, there's so many ways you could define intelligence and what specific aspects make it up that it becomes, the ways you quantify it become as varied as the concept. But in general, there's 2 things that people agree on with intelligence. One, that it's some sort of innate ability that humans just naturally possess, and 2, that it implies the use of reason in some capacity. Now, there's 2 primary objectives with my thesis. I wanted to look at historical and more modern intelligence tests to help reveal what's generally considered a part of intelligence, and I wanted to look at the role that cultural bias plays in intelligence testing to show how different cultures and races can dramatically influence test results, because understanding this enables testing developers to make more culturally fair and responsive tests. So, starting with that, we're going to start with the historical methods that I looked at. There were 4 main theorists that I looked at, and it starts off in the 16th century with an English judge named Sir Anthony FITZHERBERT. Now, his test wasn't really a test as we would think of one today, where it's the same format across all participants, and there's tables and everything to quantify it for. In the beginning, intelligence quantification was more an art or a science of intelligence qualification, where you looked at these qualitative pieces of data that you get from investigating individuals. So with Sir Anthony FITZHERBERT, he had this is a quote from a book that I had pulled from him. He looked at, the ability to count to 20, knowing who someone's mom or dad is and how old they are, and being able to understand reason in general. And at the end, he includes being able to read after somebody has taught them. So remember information after they've been taught. And that's what makes somebody not an idiot, which is the term that back then they used to define people, which I'll get into. So there's three main areas in his judgment of intelligence: basic math skills, simple metrics about yourself, and being able to learn from other people. And similar concepts to this are shared on our modern mental status examinations. When you go in to have one, you're going to be asked things like simple math questions or a basic general fund of knowledge, and you're going to be asked questions about yourself as well. Now, what I found was interesting too was English law in the 16th century differentiated between idiota a nativitate, which is ignorant by cause of birth, and idiota a causa et infirmitate, which is ignorant by cause of infirmity or ailment. So even back then they realized that there was some kind of an acute intelligence deficit and some kind of a more having to deal with genes and heritage. Now, skip ahead to the 19th century, and the first theorist that I included was Samuel Morton. He looked at intelligence through biological methods, and he claimed that the size of your brain and the size of your head influenced a lot of the factors of mental ability. So smaller head size would mean lower intelligence. My issue with him is that I can best describe his work as scientific racism, because he looked at how supposed brain size differences between races and cultures correlated to differing intelligence levels. So one of the quotes that I have in my work is him describing how the larger head size of Anglo-Americans, the Swiss, these white European nations, correlates with more levels of developed civilization, which I kind of thought was funny during his time because, slavery was still a legal practice in the United States. Women couldn't vote. The United States government had started the Indian Removal Act and had this Trail of Tears and everything. So if that's what civilization is supposed to look like, then I don't think that I share the same views as Samuel Morton here. Now, Paul BROCA took his ideas, and instead of correlating it with race, he looked at brain shape and damage to parts of the brain and looked at certain intellectual aspects. And his claims had a lot more validity than Morton's claims. And some of his work and findings are still used today. We have our little BROCA's area that's even named after him to deal with parts of generating speech in your brain. Now, the next theorist, and arguably the most important on my list, is Sir Francis Galton. He was the cousin of Charles Darwin, and he believed also, as the theorists of the time did, that intelligence was primarily biologically given, so it could be measured through biological methods. So what he came up with was something called a reaction time, or an RT test, to demonstrate intelligence. And it started simply with people just punching a bag after hearing an auditory stimulus. This is simple RT, and his results had very low validity. I included this quote here because my advisor loved it, and I liked it a lot too. His results were disappointing. Fellows of the Royal Society, for example, did not perform measurably better than the average run of the Londoners. And RT testing did suffer from this low correlation, low significance throughout its history in intelligence testing. Other scientists had more success with it. I have information here on a Dutch physiologist named Franciscus Donders, who coined the idea of choice RT, which he looked at the reaction to two or more stimuli and would take the difference in simple RT and these more complex choice RT and try to discern the choice, decision, discrimination, mental processes that were happening in these complex situations. Even with this, when they started trying to correlate RT scores to IQ scores, when IQ was finally developed, it was very hard to find any correlation. I found a study that correlated RT scores to IQ scores with basically perfect significance, and it had 5 participants. So that was correlating these choice RT scores to the Otis Army Alpha test of intelligence. So completely insignificant. Now, I would argue that the creation of the IQ test and the theory of G-factor, the two-factor theory of intelligence, are the most important events in intelligence quantification history. So there's 6 theorists that I looked at here, and there's those 2 main ideas, the G factor and the IQ scores. Now, starting with Charles Spearman is important. He is the father of the 2-factor theory of intelligence, which states that intelligence is a combination of general intelligence, which is the G factor, and very specific factors of intelligence. And G factor is really just any basic ability that underlines the performance on a variety of intellectual tasks. So no matter what you do, G factor is going to manifest itself in your performance. Now, it relates heavily to the concept of IQ because IQ was designed as a way to measure G factor, which I'll get into more here in a minute. But I want to talk about Raymond CATTELL as well, who took the 2-factor theory of intelligence and discussed crystallized and fluid intelligence models based on it. And crystallized just looks at like the sum of somebody's knowledge. You're going to hear me use the word pedagogical. It means related to teaching or learning. Crystallized intelligence is a good way to think of this pedagogical viewpoint of intelligence, just where it's the sum of what information you have learned. And there is a big difference between intelligence and knowledge, because knowledge is what you have learned, but being intelligent doesn't necessarily mean only the sum of what you have learned. And then there's the fluid model of intelligence, which is a set of mental processes that deal with novel tasks and especially with acquiring crystallized intelligence. Let me backtrack here for a second and talk about some of the very specific factors of intelligence. The best way that I can put it, as I had read in a book when I was studying for this, was that there's some people that you just describe as being athletic in general. You might have a friend that's good at soccer, basketball, baseball, football, everything. And you might just say that generally they're athletic. So their G factor would almost be that athletic ability, and it would influence it would influence their level of performance on other sports. The same applies to artists, or in a more academic view of intelligence, to people who are doing research. You might be very skilled in conducting, surveys, but you might not be as skilled in, formatting or something. It's just these very specific factors of intelligence that can be quantified somehow. Now, after the 2-factor model of intelligence was released, I think it was the next year even, ALFRED Binet came out with his, and Theodore Simon, 2 Paris French psychologists, came out with the Binet-Simon intelligence test. And it's really important to note that it was not designed as an IQ test. IQ didn't exist at this time. Their specific goal was to determine which children in a group of Paris school children were cognitively impaired and who was performing appropriately. So their initial version released in 1905, and it was revised in 1908. They had a sample of less than 100 participants, and all of them were Paris school children. Their 1908 revision divided their test into something called the year scale, based on age levels, where each level was given to an age group where the children performed the most successfully, which is how they established a mental age almost. And it's also important to understand the 3 theories of intelligence when they created their tests. They had the medical method, which is the RT testing, biological methods. They had the pedagogical method, which is, teaching and learning, that crystallized knowledge you have. And they have the psychological method, which seeks to use psychological methods to look at mental processes and garner intelligence scores from that. Now, while their test was important, I feel that they also had a lot of important contributions to standards that they set in the field of intelligence measurement as well. The one that I have up on screen, this big block quote, talks about setting a standard of only focusing on present mental state. They write that, quote, "We shall make no attempt to distinguish between acquired and congenital idiocy. We leave unanswered the question of whether this retardation is curable or even improvable. We shall limit ourselves to ascertaining the truth in regard to his present mental state. All they were trying to do was only look at the present mental state. And I think there's a couple other things that you can pull from here as well. Them saying that they're not trying to figure out what's acquired and congenital idiocy was interesting to me, because that shared similar language to Anthony FITZHERBERT, and they're two different types of idiots in the English law at the time, nativitate and infirmate, which is this same, French psychologist view here. Another thing that they'd set the standard for, which I don't have on this slide, is using a wide battery of mental tests to test intelligence. Binet is quoted as having said that a test on its own, a single test on its own, is of little value until you pair it with many tests together. And from that, you can ascertain intelligence levels, which that goes back to Donders and his choice RT, where he used several RT tests and several levels of stimuli to try to ascertain intelligence. So there's become this view that you need several sections and several test metrics to gauge intelligence instead of just one. And this is something that would continue to be developed throughout the 20th century. The next theorist, William Stern, is the father of IQ, and he wanted to supplement the Binet-Simon test and their mental age concept with IQ. So all he did was took a simple ratio of mental age to chronological age, and whenever IQ was first developed, it was a score of 1 was the average. And IQ is a great metric for measuring intelligence using the G-factor theory, because it easily highlight how delayed an individual was. So the example that I have here on the slide, if an 8-year-old takes an IQ test and gets a mental age of 4, they have an IQ of 0.5. If a 20-year-old takes an IQ test and scores a mental age of 16, they have an IQ of 0.8. It's the same number of years difference. There's 4 years difference in both of them, but it's a much smaller deviation from the standard IQ score of 1 in the older subject, which suggests a lower level of cognitive deficiency. Now, with this IQ model that's been established, Louis Terman was another theorist who tried to improve it, and he is the father of the Stanford revision of the Binet-Simon scale, which we still know and love as the Stanford-Binet intelligence scale. He created the initial version of that. So he took the concept of IQ from Stern and applied it to the Binet-Simon test, and he multiplied the score of IQ by 100 to make it easier to read and remove the fractional value issue that IQ had, because you can't take a ratio of mental age to chronological age and have fractional values. You have to have it be a whole number, or else they're between sections of their population. So what he did to evaluate his scale's effectiveness was he took 5 to 14-year-olds, which is important to note too, because whenever IQ tests were first being created, they were targeted for these younger children. They had not been standardized to adults yet, and that was an issue that researchers were going to continue having for quite a while, to be honest. But he took 905 participants for the chart I'm about to show, and was able to show that 50% of the scores fell between 903 and 108. So there's some level of standardization that is occurring. Another important thing to note is that he exclusively used white Californian children in his sample, and we're going to get to why that's important in a bit. But here's what his graph says. You can see a normal curve almost start to develop, and it's not perfect within one standard deviation, but which we would consider as 15 now, but you also have to consider at the time that standard deviations weren't standardized across entire, populations. One of the issues that I'm going to talk about in a bit too is this lack of standardization, which I'm actually going to talk about now. WECHSLER wanted to address, among other things, the lack of standardization in these Binet model tests. He wanted to, because these tests had different standard deviations at each age level. So 11-year-olds might have a standard deviation of 20 from the mean, while a 4-year-old might have a standard deviation of 30. With a 15-year-old having a standard deviation of only 12. It differs person to person. So he wanted to change it from an age ratio system to a standardized system that had the same distribution at each age level to make it easier to compare. He also really wanted to emphasize factors other than intellectual ability that are involved with intelligent behavior, as he put it. One of these things that I had used as a great example was confidence and test anxiety. So test anxiety, most people could assume what that is. It's a form of trait anxiety that occurs whenever you're taking an examination. So think of it like if I have severe test anxiety, I might have a high mental ability that's stifled whenever I go to take a test because of my test anxiety. Is that an accurate reflection of my cognitive abilities? Or is it a reflection of factors that are outside of my control that affect my intellectual abilities' ability to be quantified? So one of the ways that he tackled this was by creating the performance scale, and he utilized a combination of verbal tests and his performance scale tests to avoid an over-reliance on verbal abilities, which was another issue that he saw with the Binet model tests. His original sample consisted of 1,081 white participants who were basically all from New York. And he completely failed. He didn't completely fail, but he failed to standardize intelligence quantification, which is okay. He set the ball rolling in academia for this standardization. We have a thought process in psychology that if we fail to find significance or we fail to prove correlation, that we have failed. But it's okay to document our failures. The academic community still benefits from these failures. Now, the next section that I'm going to look at is the cultural bias in these tests. So in the decades after the development of the Stanford Binet and the WECHSLER scales, psychologists really wanted to develop culture-free intelligence tests so that they could evaluate participants from a variety of backgrounds fairly. I love my water. So, only white participants had been the sample for these tests that had been developed prior. And these, so what they did was they tried to make culture-free tests. These tests often had lower predictive validity than the standard metrics that were being used. And I include a quote from a recent study at the bottom that shows the issue of culture still in modern intelligence quantification. African American adults in the U.S. score approximately 1 standard deviation lower on measures of quantitative and verbal ability compared to Caucasian adults, and Hispanic adults 2/3 of a standard deviation lower. Think about it like this. If I were to go out and take an IQ test right now, and I was a black individual, on average, the test is designed in a way where I will score an 85 on these quantitative and verbal ability sections just because of my race and just because of my cultural upbringing. Now, Dr. Robert Williams here, he's the theorist that I chose to look at for cultural bias, because instead of trying to look at bias, or try to develop a culture-free test, he wanted to develop a culture-specific test. So he created the Black Intelligence Scale of Cultural Homogeneity, the BITCH 100, and he wanted to pick up on intellectual indicators not commonly found on these conventional tests, which is similar language to WECHSLER's, but he was looking at culture instead of these nonverbal abilities. So the difference in IQ between white and black participants to Williams, he didn't attribute to any sort of mental or capacity or physical difference. What he focused on was culture and experience. I pulled a quote from his writings. He's saying that black children do not have the same experiences which facilitate the spontaneous acquisition of school-relevant skills and tend to perform poorly on IQ tests. And more importantly, their low IQs reflect cultural differences rather than inferior mental capacities. He was able to successfully, using his BITCH 100, he was able to successfully demonstrate that black participants were scoring better than white participants, and he had a pretty fair significance level for it. I didn't include it on my presentation here. So what he concluded was that students all have an average or an above average ability, and it was tapped by the BITCH 100. So this almost raises the idea that specific intelligence metrics are going to allow participants to excel based on test design instead of strictly their G factor. And when I was discussing this with the faculty at my school as well, the idea was brought up that physical differences could also be an example of one of the hindrances. On some of the WECHSLER scale tests, you have blocks that you have to physically manipulate, and your score is affected by the speed at which you manipulate these blocks and complete the puzzles. That is going to be an example of test design, making it so participants can excel or can be left unfairly tested. So there's three. I looked into where bias really is introduced in this testing, and there's three primary sources of bias that needs to be considered. There's construct bias, predictive bias, and item bias. Construct bias is whenever an irrelevant aspect of your study or metric design skews the results. The example that I included was a European value study, and the Spanish survey takers had significantly different results than the rest of the European nations who took the test. And whenever they looked into it, it turns out that the Spanish word for loyalty had sexual faithfulness connotations behind it. So that's an example of skewing the result of a question towards an irrelevant aspect. Predictive bias is when there's between group difference that is significant. So think of it like the IQ difference between white people or white participants and black participants. That's not necessarily a good indicator of intellectual deficiencies in one group or the other. It's an example of bias that exists when one group is consistently scoring lower than the other. And the last thing is item bias, and this is things like overly ambiguous questions, poorly translated, poorly worded, things like that. And especially with item bias, the verbal reasoning sections are highly prone to this kind of cultural bias, which the BITCH 100 showed. They used examples of vocabulary that were common in the black culture, the black American culture at the time, and if intelligence was gauged based off of a knowledge of that culture, then it was going to be prone to that cultural bias. Even within cultures or between languages, phrases and words don't have the same meanings or connotations whenever they're translated. And it's the same with cultures, like I had started stuttering a second ago. So think of idioms like bite the bullet. These American phrases that are used might not translate well across languages or cultures. So you've heard all of these facts about intelligence testing. So let's get into my discussion that I had about intelligence testing. So the first thing that I needed to state in my discussion was that this bias that intelligence testing has is not unique to intelligence testing, but rather to any concept that's defined through abstraction. And abstraction, as the APA defines it, is the formation of general ideas or concepts by extracting similarities from particular instances. So just think of it, just remember that on a case-by-case basis, whenever you look at something that's abstract, an abstract idea like intelligence or love, there's going to be differences in the common features that individuals use to define these concepts. Think of the difference in the intelligence testing methods. Somebody might think of like the entirety of the knowledge somebody possesses as their intelligence, this pedagogical method. Another person might look at the ability to use this knowledge and make inferences whenever they find something new, more of a psychological method. And a good way to show these differences is an example that I used in my resilience class last semester. This is a rectangle. You know, there's no doubt about it. It's a rectangle, square, whatever you'd like to call it. And you might have some idea of what it represents. But as soon as I throw a triangle on top, you are probably much more likely to have an idea of what this represents. And then if I add in, another rectangle, some squares, I think that it's safe to say that this can be interpreted as a house. But what makes it a house? It's just, a loose collection of shapes. There's nothing stating that this is a house. So going back to this slide, this is just a box and a triangle. But I have come to look at this collection of shapes and this arrangement of shapes to be representative of a house. For other people, they might need to see that door, or they might need to see the windows that are on the house in order to start calling it a house. This is similar to intelligence. Some people might have a view of intelligence that only needs to look at this bank of knowledge, like this. It might just need to be a square and a triangle. Some people might need to see those cognitive processes. Some people might need to see the ability for reasonable logic. And some people are going to add up these factors to make a more full picture. This is what intelligence's issue is. It's such a subjective concept that trying to define it adds bias just due to the creator's views of intelligence. So think of it like this. Who's going to deem what parts of intelligence are even valuable? So I'd given an example of a professor with a broken car. Are they intellectually inferior or superior to the mechanic who comes and fixes their vehicle? They have very different crystallized knowledge banks. So is it safe to say that the person who might be considered more academically intellectual, this professor, is superior to the mechanic who fixes their vehicle when they have zero knowledge of automobiles? There's no correct answer. And this is what I've been saying about any metric that exists to gauge intelligence is going to be biased to the creators and their abstraction of intelligence, and even the people who look at the results and try to interpret that into a score of intelligence as well. So think of Williams. His abstraction of intelligence could have been the black culture and the vocabulary within the black culture. It's important to consider context in the realm of intelligence, because this professor in a classroom we might be considering as a very intellectual man, and when we pass by them on the side of the road with a broken car and they don't know what to do, we might kind of lose that same view of them. So one of the ways that I'd thrown out there on my thesis was that in order to look at intelligence in a more fair view, we could try doing what BINET Simon had done. They looked at school children's success in their respective domains. So you could make a similar test that retroactively looks at success in different domains. You can look at academic success, occupational success, social success. You could look at all of these and make almost a G of life score. And there's a lot of factors that you could examine in these, and it would be a very qualitative examination of success. But if we're judging intelligence as the ability to successfully be able to perform in a certain setting, then this might be an appropriate metric. Now, that's a lot of information. I'm going to go ahead and have my conclusion now. And there's just 2 slides of important things to consider. To start off, you have to consider that intelligence quantification has developed mainly from biological methods of testing to these pedagogical and psychological methods that we use today and during the 20th century. Over time, sample sizes have increased, and slowly the samples have become more representative as research has progressed. And it's important to remember that these samples are representative of their populations to help avoid biased testing standardization, which is negatively going to affect groups, such as the IQ score deviation in those test sections. Slowly, we've been able to have a more extensive array of mental abilities that have been evaluated, and this has begun to be proven effective, such as WECHSLER's performance scale. There's an apparent difference in scores between cultures and races in specific that needs to be addressed and needs to be re-standardized. And it's important to remember that this is not explicitly due to inferiority between or within a group. Remember what Williams had said, where he discussed that it is the experiences of black children that affect their abnormal scoring on IQ tests, rather than inferior mental capacities. And remember too that it's test design, it's the item bias that is present within these tests that can affect these abnormal scores instead of these inferior capacities. It's largely unlikely that we're ever going to have a perfect test of intelligence, but there's some hope that we're going to approach that point and that we're going to have a more fair test and that we're going to have a better understanding of intelligence to look at it in a way that is more functional to our world. Now, I ended with a quote from BINET and Simon because I really respected their views on intelligence. So what they stated was that intellectual qualities are not superposable and cannot be measured as linear surfaces are measured, but are on the contrary a classification, a hierarchy among diverse intelligences. And it's for this reason that they decided that they needed a metric to quantify intelligence. Thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed it. I am planning on doing my master's thesis on intelligence as a concept and more of this cultural bias, and I'm looking at doing one of the diversity, equity, and inclusion fellowships on this as well, where we're going to be able to hire interns on to work with us maybe. So if that goes through, I'll hopefully have a video about it, and hopefully I'll be able to start doing some videos on presenting skills, research skills, formatting, things like that. I'm also trying to learn R at the moment because my thesis advisor got interested in learning R, so I'm wanting to take a look at it as well, so maybe there'll be a video on that. Who knows? That's all for me. I hope you enjoyed and learned something, and I will see you next time.